I'm honored to be part of this celebration of kindering. I first learned of this wonderful organization several years ago. Your mission of hope spoke to me, providing support to children of diverse abilities and their families, and services to nurture hope, courage, and the skills to soar, which is not far from Starbucks' mission to inspire and nurture the human spirit, one person, one cup, one neighborhood at a time. And your mission also spoke to me as a person who identifies as a disability rights activist. I claim that moniker with pride. I've supported persons with disabilities for most of my life. And I reflected on that this past year as we celebrated the 30th anniversary of the passage of the American with Disabilities Act, a landmark civil rights legislation which not only prohibits discrimination based on disability, but also changed our very perspectives about the dignity and worth of all persons with disabilities. You know, I credit my passion about disability rights to my childhood. My cousin Barbara was 1 year older than me. She was in my group of cousins, a cohort, and Barbara was different. Different speech patterns, different abilities to understand social cues, a different speed of how she operated. Barbara's disability was not defined then, and I still don't know what it is now. But her parents, particularly my Aunt Mary, were fierce advocates for services for her. And that was 60 years ago when resources were scarce. But Barbara went to college, community college. She got a job, and she now still thrives independently, living on her own. And I had a neighbor named Denny. He was developmentally disabled, a bit more severely than Barbara. And he was about 10 years or 15 years older than those of us who played together in a childhood gang. But he loved us, he played with us, he did kickball and hide and go seek. And he was a gentle soul. And what I remember is we never ever mocked or made fun of him. We just loved him. And I didn't know then, but I realize now that these relationships deeply shaped me. And in college, when I was invited to work at an Easter Seals camp, a residential camp for children and adults with a variety of physical, mental, and emotional disabilities, those were the happiest summers of my life. And I learned big lessons about the authentic respect, dignity, and appreciation of all people with disabilities and their families who love them. And what I learned then was about independence for those persons with disabilities. The campers at that camp made their own decisions about their schedules and activities. They were independent. And I became humbled to experience what it's really like to support a person living with a disability. As a teenager, I was feeding, bathing, changing adult diapers of people that gave their bodies to me to take care of. It was a wonderful time and experience. An impactful relationship from my camp experience was my friend Helen. Helen had spastic cerebral palsy, no use of her arms and legs, and little use of her voice. But she could talk if you took the time to understand her, you could. And one day I was swimming with Helen in the swimming pool, and Helen was trying to tell me something. And after 3 or 4 tries, I still didn't understand, so I pretended that I did. And she took her fist and hit the water and told me never ever to do that again, never to patronize her. If I didn't understand her, I was to stop and ask her to say it again. And it was a lesson that I never forgot. After camp, I finished law school and went into the private practice of law, and I didn't love it. And I looked for work with more meaning, and I took a social worker role at a place called the Center for Accessible Living. And that was part of the independent living movement that began in the late 70s and 80s, in which people were providing services supporting equal opportunities, self-determination, and self-respect and independence for persons with disabilities. My job was an advocacy counselor, both individual and policy advocacy. I represented individuals gaining access to benefits or challenging discrimination, and I advocated for legislative policies championing the rights of people with disabilities. And what I learned in that job was a lot about the rights and dignities of people with disabilities, ending victimization or pity or a medical view of persons who just happen to be disabled, but instead thinking of them not as sick or defective or less than, but neither brave or courageous simply because they did ordinary things in life like marry or live in their own communities or have a job. And I learned that not all people with disabilities are the same. People that were blind and people that were deaf and people that used wheelchairs or had autism all had different kind of expectations. but they all had one community. And most importantly, back then, I got the advantage to connect with a group of people underground championing for the rights of people with disabilities. A group that I got particularly inspired by was ADAPT, which is a national grassroots community that organizes disability rights activists beginning in the 1970s and 80s to engage in nonviolent direct action, including civil disobedience, to assure the civil and human rights of people with disabilities to live in freedom. And I participated with them in local protest, marches. I watched people in wheelchairs tying themselves to buses to protest against inaccessible public transportation. A tremendously impactful moment in my life was when I got to participate with ADAPT in a protest in Atlanta, Georgia. The Department of Transportation was meeting there to consider legislation regarding accessible public transportation. And hundreds of wheelchair users and other persons with disabilities gathered and converged upon that site and asked for an audience to talk about their rights to public transportation. And when they didn't get in, they conducted a sit-in. And they sat right down in the federal building in Atlanta. And when they weren't heard, they got out of their wheelchairs and lay on the ground. And my support role as what we call a temporary able-bodied person was to help them and support them in that sit-in. And we stayed there overnight with permission from President George H.W. Bush. And this was just one example of brave disability advocates taking to the streets to demand their rights. It was a moment that changed my life. Watching these brave advocates speaking their truth and speaking up for change. If you haven't seen the movie Crip Camp, I highly recommend it. It's about a camp in the 70s, Camp Jeanette in New York, for teens with disabilities. And those campers became the activists in the disability rights movement that fought for the passage of the Americans with Disability Act. And those actions eventually led to the passage of the ADA in 1990. I was so thrilled to be part of that moment in history. When I left the Center for Accessible Living and moved to Seattle in the early 1990s and took back up the private practice of law, I looked out for ways in which I could use my volunteer hours to support the disability rights organizations in the Seattle area. I'm a bit of a volunteer-aholic. And I worked at an independent living center for the blind, supported housing rights, and now I'm still co-director of a camp for residential recreation for adults with disabilities every summer in Vashon. And when I joined Starbucks 21 years ago as a litigator, I utilized my experiences, even though that was in my job description, to champion and support our efforts to become a more accessible and inclusive company. An organization called Disability Rights Advocates once challenged Starbucks and told us that our handoff plane, the place where we handed off a beverage in our stores, were too high and couldn't be reached by people in wheelchairs or people of shorter stature. And rather than fight that, we talked to the organization and figured out how we could do better. And we eventually lowered those planes. So not only they were more accessible to people with disabilities, but actually we opened up the ability for the barista to interact with all customers, disabled or not. 30 years after the passage of the landmark Americans with Disabilities Act, I reflect back on when I became a disability rights advocate in the first place. And I think back of my childhood and the relationships of the people I loved and those who advocated for them. I realized the respect, dignity, and value that all persons had. And I honor, appreciate, and respect everything you do to fight for the hope, dignity, and respect of your children. I'm so sorry that the chaos in the world right now particularly impacts you and your children. But I know that you will fight, just like my Aunt Mary did for my cousin Barbara 60 years ago. Now, at age 65, Barbara is thriving, independent, with a job, and living on her own, and has a life worth living, even without her parents. Thank you for your fierce advocacy and support for your children. And thank you, Kindering, for being a beacon of light and hope. You are an organization worthy of our support.